Hello, this is Dr. Anthony Fesmire, and this lesson we will compose the harmonic progression for a 32-measure AABA jazz form. For this composition, we will use diatonic harmony in a major key, along with secondary dominants and related two chords. Let's get started. The first thing that I will do is write in 8 measures for the A section. Now, as we work through this example, we'll talk about a number of the common features that are found in standard jazz tunes starting in about the late 1920s through most of the 1950s, what is often referred to as tonal jazz. The majority of jazz tunes that are in the 32-bar AABA jazz form are in a single key but use a number of chromatic chords. So sometimes they appear to modulate. For our example, we'll stay in the key of C major. Now, many jazz tunes will start squarely in the key. So for example, we might start with the 1 chord and then move on from there. A great example of this is the tune Take the A Train, which begins with the C major 7 chord. Other tunes will start more ambiguous. For example, the jazz standard Body and Soul starts with a 2 chord and that is followed by a secondary dominant chord of 5/7 2 and then returns to the 2. It's in the key of D flat major, so those chords are E flat minor, B flat 7, back to E flat minor. The initial perception is that this tune is in the key of E flat minor, but in fact it's in D flat major. What both Body and Soul and Take the A Train have in common is that they hit a 1 chord here at measure 7. And by the time it hits that chord, it is clear what key we are in. To compose the harmonic progression for the remainder of the A section, I could start here at the beginning and work my way through with a strong resolution on that 1 chord. For our example, I'm going to do something that I call backtracking, where I'm going to start with the 1 chord and I'm going to work backwards from there. In tonal jazz, the typical chord to precede the 1 chord would be the 5/7. And recently we learned about the idea of the related 2 chord and how common 2 chords are in jazz, especially paired with the 5. So let's precede that with the 2 chord. Now that we've included our 2-5-1 leading to a strong cadence, there are a variety of things that we could do leading into this D minor chord. We could go with diatonic chords. For example, we could start with a 1 chord in this measure. Or we could use a 6th chord, A minor 7, which would give us down a 5th root motion. 6-2-5-1 is a very common chord progression. Or we could use a secondary dominant chord leading into the D minor with an A7. Let's go ahead and use that chord. And secondary dominants are very often paired with the related 2 chord. If we think temporarily in the key of D minor, A7 would be the 5, and the 2 chord would be either E minor 7 flat 5 or E minor 7. Both are acceptable choices. E minor 7 flat 5 is the typical 2 chord in D minor. E minor 7 is the 3 chord in the key of C major, and then also works as a related 2 with A7, so that is an acceptable choice as well. I will go ahead and use E minor 7. Notice that I analyzed this chord in 2 different ways. I analyzed it with the Roman numeral as a 3 minor 7 because that's what it is in the key of C major. But I also included the bracket to show that it is the related 2 chord with A7. Now let's continue to backtrack from here. One option in this measure is to go back to using diatonic chords, so chords from the key of C major. A common chord to use would be the G7, the 5/7. It's a common deceptive resolution in jazz to go from 5/7 to 3. Another choice would be to use a 5 of the 3 chord, and that is a B7. Another choice would be to use the 3 chord as an interpolated 2 chord and use a 5 of the A7. that would be an E7 chord. Since the diatonic A chord in the key of C major would be A minor 7, 6, this would be a 5-7 of 6. Now thinking temporarily in the key of A minor, the key of the 6th chord, our related 2 chord would be B minor 7 flat 5, which is also Roman numeral 7 in the key of C. Now from here we could continue to backtrack and we might end up somewhere that seems fairly distant from the key of C major. But by the time that we get to measure 7, it will be clear that we are in the key of C. But I will go ahead and start with the C major 7 chord here in measure 1. In measure 2, I will do a 2 and a 5 and back to 1 to really set up the key at the beginning. And then from there, we'll have this progression that's a bit of a departure that brings us back to that 1 chord. Here's what our progression sounds like with a rhythm section performing it in a swing style. And for the AABA form, we would repeat this section before moving on to the B section. Here's our 8-measure setup for the B section. The B section typically serves as a point of departure from the A section. Keep in mind that the A section is repeated 3 times with A, then we have our B section as our point of departure, and then we return to the A one more time. In fact, the B section serves as that point of departure, but it also serves as a way to transition back to the final A section, and that's what we will do with our B section. On occasion, a composer will modulate for the B section. A great example of this is the tune Body and Soul, which is in the key of D flat major, but modulates to the key of D major up a half step for the B section. What is more typical, though, is to stay in the original key, and it's quite common to focus around the area of the 4 chord for the B section. Great example of this is Take the A Train, which uses the 4 chord for 4 measures for the first half of the B section. Other tunes will use the 4 chord in the 3rd measure and use a secondary dominant and perhaps a related 2 to lead into that. For our example, I'm going to go ahead and start with the 4 chord. Then in the 2nd measure, use the related 2 and the 5-7 of 4, and then return to the 4 chord in measure 3. Now I could continue composing from here and finish off the rest of my B section, but keep in mind that the B section is a departure from the A section, which I already have with the focus on the 4 chord. But the B section also brings us back to the A section. So next I'm going to backtrack from the C and fill in some chords that will help lead me back to the A section. Now the typical chord to precede the 1 chord would be the 5-7, G7. I can either use that for an entire measure or use it for a half a measure. If I use it for a half a measure, I want to pair it with the related 2 chord, D minor 7. I'll go ahead and use it for an entire measure for this example. Now I could use that D minor 7, the related 2 chord, in the previous measure, but I'm going to go ahead and try something different this time. I'm going to instead use a 5-7 of 5, D7. For this example, I'm going to continue to work backwards using dominant 7 chords. So here I could put an A7 chord. Now A7 is 5-7 of D minor, and D minor is 2 in the key, so this would be 5-7 of 2. But since the next chord is still some type of D chord, it will work really nicely in this progression. What I'm setting up is a series of dominant chords moving down a 5th, or what is known as a cycle of dominants. I'm going to continue along with that cycle of dominants next by doing an E7 chord. E7 is 5-7 of A. A would be A minor in the key of C, and A minor is 6. So E7 would be a 5-7 of 6, but it will lead nicely to an A7 chord. Now we have our departure from the A section with our chord progression that focuses around the 4 chord, the F major 7 chord. And we also have a progression that is returning us strongly back to the A section. Next, we need a couple of chords that will help bridge from the 4 over to this returning chord progression. For our example, I will go ahead and use a G7 chord here. G7 is 5-7 in the key of C, typically moves back to the C chord, but a common deceptive resolution is to move down a third, and we're moving down a third here to the E7. With that G7, I will put the related 2, which is a D minor chord. Moving from the 4 to a 2 is a very common chord progression. So I managed to bridge between our departure and our progression that is returning us to A. Now before we finish our example, we need to insert just a few more chords. Here we're going back to our first 2 A sections, and notice that I left space here in these 2 measures. These 2 measures will be transition measures that bring us on to the next section, which is sometimes called a turnaround progression. So here at the end of the first A section, I will be returning to the A section, which starts with a C major 7 chord. It would be common to precede that chord with a 5-7, a G7. So I'm going to go ahead and put a G7 here on beat 3, and then I'm going to include D minor 7, the related 2, on beat 1. Now the second A section is not moving back to the A and therefore back to a C major. Instead it's moving on to the B section, which starts with the 4 chord. A common transition would be to backtrack and use the 5-7 of 4 here on beat 3 and use the related 2, G minor 7, along with that. Now taking a look at the end of the final A section, we have another blank measure here. Now if we were only going to play through our AABA form one time, we would just end here on the 1 chord. But it's common in jazz to repeat the form multiple times, with the first time being the melody, and then having improvisation for several times, and then returning to the melody again at the end. When the form is repeated, we need a progression to bring us back to the beginning, and here we could use the 5-7 again, G7 to return us to C major 7, and D minor 7, the related 2. Here's what the entire progression and form sound like, performed by a rhythm section in a medium swing feel.